Okay, hello. In this Google Meet, we will be going over Unit 3, Activity 1. So we will be introducing our novel unit. And if you take a look at our announcement that I've posted this morning, you'll notice that the novel that we're going to read is called The Great Gatsby, which has been a very famous book for uh, just about 100 years. It's an older book, but I still think it is relevant today, and people still talk about it, and it's still a very popular book in schools in Canada and in America and around the world today. It's still so popular that they recently made it into a movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, and they've made it into a number of movies over the years. By all means, I can't. Students will like to watch the movie that goes along with the book, but I would be very careful because I'm just going to warn you right now. The movie has many differences. No matter which movie you watch of The Great Gatsby, they do have many differences compared to the book. So what I would do is I would read the book first and then watch the movie later if you're interested. Okay, but it doesn't. Watching the movie will not replace the book. With that said, let's see if we can introduce The Great Gatsby. And so, what you'll see in Unit 3, Activity 1, is that I'm going to try to introduce the book. I'm going to try to introduce the author, and I'm going to try to give you some background on the book. And then I'm going to get you started and ask you to read 2 chapters, the first 2 chapters of the book. And each week, we're going to read usually 2 chapters. Okay, so that will be your goal, is to read 2 chapters every week. Most weeks you'll have to do an assignment as well, as you usually do. You usually do an assignment every week in this course. But for this first beginning of the book, I'm not going to give you an assignment. I just want to give you time to start reading and make sure that you don't fall behind with the reading. And so if we take a look, if we go inside the page, we've got, see if I can make this bigger. Okay, we've got Chapter 3, Activity 1, Introducing the Great Gatsby. And you'll notice right away there is no assignment page. There is just a content page this week. And so the book we're going to read was written by a man named F. Scott Fitzgerald. And he was a very interesting man. Him and his wife lived a very interesting life. And a lot of the details in his books have been taken from his own life. So it's important that we know about him maybe a little bit before we read the book so that we have a better understanding of his characters. For example, in the book that you're going to read, The Great Gatsby, I would argue that 2 of the main characters are supposed to represent F. Scott Fitzgerald in different ways. And I would argue that the main woman character, a woman named Daisy in the book, is supposed to be F. Scott Fitzgerald's real life wife. So the more we know about his own life, I think the more we'll understand the book. The book is not a biography. He certainly is making things up, and characters have different names and different things happen from his own life, but he's definitely drawing from his own life. So I have a little video that you can watch here called F. Scott Fitzgerald Mini Biography. And I would suggest you take a look at the video and get a little background on the author. And then I've got some historical context. If you remember from Unit 2, historical context is part of setting. And what I mean by historical context is the background knowledge that you need to better understand a story. And so it's kind of my job as the teacher and the job of the course website to give you some of that background knowledge. I can't expect you to know the history of the book. So I have to try to give you some of that history. And this book takes place during the 1920s. So it takes place literally 100 years ago. And the 1920s are an extremely interesting time in history. I'm a history teacher. That's my first teachable. They need me to teach English because English, we need lots of English teachers right now at St. Mike's. But I really like history. And the 1920s is a very interesting time in history. It was called the Roaring Twenties. And it was a time period when the world sped up. You have people getting cars for the first time, many people. You have people getting radios for the first time. You have people getting telephones in their home, many of them for the first time. People's lives are changing very quickly. And I like to call it the first modern decade, where the world kind of started to look and feel maybe a little bit like it does today. Obviously things have changed a lot over the last 100 years, but the 1920s was a very interesting time. It was an interesting time for music. It was an interesting time for technology. It was a very interesting time for women in society. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is to watch a second little video here called The Roaring Twenties, just to give you a little background about what that time period was like. Because if you don't understand the 1920s at all, then you might not understand the characters and the behavior of the characters in the book. For example, in the 1920s in the United States, because the book will take place in New York in the United States. In the 1920s in the United States, they had something called prohibition, which means that alcohol was banned. There was no selling, no drinking, no buying of alcohol. It was the law in the country. The law didn't last that long. It just lasted for a few years in the 1920s, and then they changed it. And obviously, alcohol is legal in the United States now. But during the time of our book, alcohol will be illegal. And so that will be an important point that you might need to know to better understand the book. You'll see that a lot of the characters, despite the fact that alcohol is illegal, a lot of the characters will be drinking alcohol in the book. And so that'll be part of understanding the history. Okay. All right. So we've talked a little bit about the author. We've talked a little bit about the history. Now about the book itself. And this is just going to be a little explanation or a little background on the book itself. The book is interesting because you have a character named Nick that is going to tell the story. So Nick is going to be the narrator, but he's not going to focus on his own story. He's going to tell the story of his friend, Jay Gatsby. So the book is called The Great Gatsby, and that's because the main character is going to be a man named Jay Gatsby. So what's interesting, though, is Jay Gatsby is not telling his own story, and we don't actually get to really truly meet Jay Gatsby until I suppose you could say that we meet him a little bit at the very ending of chapter 1, but for the most part, we don't get introduced to who Jay Gatsby is until chapter 3. So it's an interesting book where the main character isn't even introduced really to the reader until chapter 3. And so do read a little background here so that you understand the book a little more. The characters in the book are very famous. So, in America and around the world, people know Nick, they know Jay Gatsby, they know Daisy. The characters that are the main characters in the book have become very famous characters. So again, just read a little background here so that you get a little understanding of the book. The book is going to deal with some people or some characters in the book are going to be extremely rich. And so Jay Gatsby, for example, you're going to have a couple other characters that are going to be extremely rich. And so just to give you an example, if you click right here, you can see the actual mansion, the actual home that is supposed to be Jay Gatsby's home in the book. And so, this is what it looks like. And you can actually visit this home in the state of New York. It is a massive mansion with all sorts of this huge like water area here with fountains and all sorts of things. It's a crazy house. Now it's being used as a hotel and as a place for events like weddings and things like that. It's referred to as a castle. But when you read the book and when you read where Jay Gatsby lives, this is where he's supposed to live. And so I guess one of the things you need to understand about the book is that we're dealing with some characters that are extremely wealthy. And some of the characters are going to be what we call old money, and some of the characters are going to be what we call new money. And that's going to be a really important idea in the story. And so, just real quickly, and you'll find out more about this as you read, but old money are people that have had money for generations. So, people whose parents were rich and whose grandparents were rich and whose great grandparents were rich. And so, when they're born, they already have a lot of money and they never really have to work to make money. They're called old money. Whereas new money are people that are not born rich. They're born poor, they're born without a lot of money, but they find a way to make themselves rich and to earn money. And so in this book, there's going to be a lot of competition or a lot of conflict between old money and new money because they kind of don't like each other. And then off to the side, maybe the saddest characters in the book are going to be the characters I like to call no money, because there's some characters in the book that are very poor and don't have any money. And so one of the things you'll need to really focus on in the book is sort of the social classes and the economic or financial situations of the characters. All right, I'll leave that alone. Just again, take a look here. This just gives you a little background on what the book is about. Okay. If we continue on here, I'm going to give you some pre-reading tips. So you can read this book a couple of different ways. You can read it online. So if you click on Planet ebook here, if I open that, you'll see that you have an ebook that you can read here, and you can make it as big as you want, which is nice. Okay. And so if you want, and it's got all the chapters here, it's got the entire book right here online. So if you want, you can read the book right on your Chromebook, right on your laptop. I'm not someone that likes to read on a cell phone because it's too small for me. But if you want, you can read this on your cell phone. So you can read this on any device you like. It's also an ebook, so if you want, you can download it and then put it on any device you want. So like, for example, I know my parents have e-readers. So they have those devices that are meant just for reading ebooks, and they like to read books on them. So you can download this book and read it on any device you want, or you can just open up this page and you can read it from whatever device you're currently using. And so again, you can click on Planet ebook and you can read the book that way. Or if you prefer, you can open up a YouTube. You can open up a YouTube link here, and they actually have lots of YouTube links. So if you type in The Great Gatsby full text here, or ebook, you'll find lots of the book is not going to change. It's just going to be different people reading it. But you can find lots of different versions of Great Gatsby as an ebook. So if you want, you can listen to the book. What I would strongly suggest doing, though, is if you're going to listen to the book, is to listen to it with the captions on, or to listen to it where they have the text on the screen as well too. I think you'll learn and you'll understand it better, and you'll practice your reading more if you're actually reading the text along with someone speaking. Okay, but those are your two choices. You can read the book online or on any device you like, or you can listen to it on YouTube. I shouldn't say this out loud, but I'll say it, but I can't make promises here. I have some students that really like an actual book. Okay. And, used to be that we would give out books to every student and they would have the books for the whole semester and they could read the book and then give it back at the ending of the semester. But more and more, we as schools are going to online reading because so they don't like us buying new books. Long story short, I know we have some copies of The Great Gatsby here at St. Michael's. I don't know. I know some other teachers may be using them. And if teachers are using The Great Gatsby in their classes, then they have the first chance to actually use the books. But if you would like a paper copy of The Great Gatsby, a paperback copy, send me an email and I'll see what I can do. But there's no promises. Please don't go out and buy the book, though. If you want, the library should have plenty of copies of The Great Gatsby for free. But I don't want you spending any money. If you'd like, email me and I'll see what I can do. But for now, you've got the book online or on YouTube. All right. Second tip here. We will break up the novel into 6 sections. So we're going to read this book over 6 weeks. So each week you'll get a new activity, and each week you'll be asked to read approximately 2 chapters. So that's about 30 pages. Later in the book, there's a really big chapter, and so that week we'll just do 1 chapter. But for the most part, you're going to have to read 2 chapters every week, and you don't want to fall too far behind. I find in this online course that this is usually the spot where some students start to fall behind. They don't keep up with the reading and they fall behind. So please, this first week, I'm not giving you an assignment. I want you to get started with the reading, chapter 1 and chapter 2, as you'll see, and then we'll go from there. So I don't want us to fall behind. I want us to be reading. Okay. I am going to give you for every chapter, and so this is Great Gatsby. Actually, I'll turn this into a Google Doc instead of a Word document here. But what I'll do is for each activity, I will give you chapter questions. So I'm asking you to read chapter 1 and chapter 2. So I'm giving you chapter questions to do this week. I would suggest when you finish each chapter to do the chapter questions, or maybe answer the chapter questions as you're reading, if you like. These chapter questions, they will not be graded. I'm not going to ask you to submit these questions. Chapter questions will not be graded, but they will help you prepare for the assignments that you have to do, and they will help you prepare for the final exam, because The Great Gatsby will be important on your final exam. So these chapter questions are meant to be sort of a study guide to show you the characters and the events and the things from the book that you need to remember. So I would definitely do the chapter questions each week. But again, I leave them with you. I don't ask you to submit them, and they're not graded. They're just your chance to make sure that you're understanding the book. Okay. While you're reading the book, I would suggest that you make a character list. It's not a requirement. I'm not going to ask you to hand me in a list of characters. But for me, I've always found when I read a book that if I keep track of the characters on paper, it is one of the best ways for me to remember what's happening in the book and to remember who's who. So that would be my suggestion, is to make a character list. There will be a fair number of characters in this book. So as you go, you'll meet a lot of characters. I would say there's probably 8 kind of main characters. There's probably 8 characters that you'd need to know really well. But if you keep track of characters as you go, it's a really good idea. If they mention a character, like for example, the Great Gatsby, Jay Gatsby, is going to have these big parties at his mansion, and he's going to invite all these famous people, and he's going to have these giant parties with lots of people. And sometimes they'll mention the names of some of the people that are attending his parties. If they just mention the name of somebody once offhand, and the person never speaks or never has a role, I wouldn't expect you to know them. But if a character has a role in the book and has a speaking part and has something to do with the main characters, then you definitely want to remember them. And the chapter questions will be a good guide. If I ask about a character in the chapter questions, that's a good hint that I expect you to remember that character. Last but not least, there is another worksheet that I'm giving you, and I'm giving you this ahead of time. It's called The Great Gatsby: Colors and Symbols. This book is very famous for its symbolism. Almost everything in the book has a deeper kind of hidden meaning. And so, what I'm going to ask you to do, and this hopefully is rather simple, is every time you read a chapter, I just want you to jot down something or maybe a couple of things, if you notice, that are the different colors. So, for example, excuse me, in the first, is it going to let me type here? No, I'm going to have to change this, I think. Okay, there. In the first chapter, there's going to be two characters, Daisy and Jordan. They're going to wear white dresses. Okay, so maybe you might want to write down Daisy and Jordan's white dresses. Later in the book, I think we'll first hear about it in chapter 4. We're going to find that, for example, Jay Gatsby has a yellow car, for example. Okay. So just as we go through the book, if you notice things that are white, gold, yellow, or on the second page, we have green, blue, and gray. All I want you to do, and you don't have to write down every single little thing that is green, blue, and gray, right? But just see if you can find something whenever you notice. So you don't have to fill in every single box either, but see if you can find in the book 5 or 6 different things that are white, 5 or 6 different things that are gold, yellow, green, blue, and gray. And then at the ending of chapter 7, you'll see that we're going to come back to this, and I'm going to talk about the significance of this, and I'm going to ask you to submit your list. Okay, so just keep track of your list here. I'm doing this ahead of time just so that you can kind of get started with this. You don't have to hand this in this week. You don't have to hand it in next week, but eventually we'll get to this. And what I'd like you to do is what I'll challenge you to do, and we'll talk more about this later, is when you get to chapter 7 and you've got a list of different things that are white, gold, yellow, I'm going to ask your opinion. What do you think that color symbolizes in the book? So if you take all of the things that you wrote down that are white, what do you think is the message? What do you think F. Scott Fitzgerald is saying about the objects that are white? And then the same thing for gold, for yellow, for blue, for green, for gray. I just want you thinking about this now, because you'll notice in chapter 1 and chapter 2, as you start reading, that certain objects will be white, gold, and yellow. And I want you to start just jotting them down. Okay. And that's it for Unit 3, Activity 1. Again, it'll just be a reminder here. At the bottom, it'll say there is no assignment to submit this week. So again, there's no button to push to go to the assignment. But I do expect you to read chapters 1 and 2. I expect you to take a look at the chapter questions. And I expect you to get started or to notice some of the colors that are mentioned as you're reading. And that's it. If you've got any questions, please let me know. And yeah, I hope we all have a good time getting started with The Great Gatsby.